Thank you, Bob, for that great introduction. I'm also a parent, along with my husband, Dave, of 3 teenagers. So I am very much living youth ministry in our home. And this weekend on Saturday, our oldest, Nathan, will be submitting his 11th and final college application. But I tell you, after spending 2 great days here at Calvin, we might need to add a 12th, because This is an incredible school, and it's an honor and a joy and a privilege to be with you. I've spent the last 3 decades working with teenagers and young adults, and on the long list of what I love about young people, it's that they're so very honest. And I especially love that about middle schoolers. And one day, as I was leading a middle school small group, a middle school girl, a 7th grade girl, came up to me, and she had a friend on either arm. And she walked up to me and she said, "Kara, I have a question. What's a prostitute?" Now, the girl on either arm kind of did what you just did. They kind of laughed and giggled. And then she said, "No, wait a second. That's the wrong word. I mean something that we are." And I said, "Do you mean a Protestant?" And she said, yes, that's exactly what I mean. But every once in a while, young people say something that's not quite as amusing. And I remember when a young person at my own church, we'll call him Connor, age 15, said this: "The only time I think about God is when I'm at church. The only time I really think about faith," said this young person, and I think that's representative of the young people that we care about in our churches, in our families, is when I'm at church. Beloved senior trustee at Fuller Seminary, Max Dupree, who recently passed away, he said this: "The first job of leaders is to define reality." And so let's define reality today of what's happening in the church and what's happening with young people. The best research, if you look at a compilation of studies, the best research indicates that about 1 in 2 young people from great churches like yours and great families like yours, about 1 in 2 young people will drift from God and the church after they graduate from high school. Not only are youth group graduates drifting from church, but our churches are also aging. 18 to 29-year-olds. How many of you in this room are 18 to 29? Raise your hand. We are thrilled with how many of you are here. 18 to 29-year-olds in our U.S. population. You represent 17% of our U.S. population, and yet you're only 10% of U.S. church-going attendance. So churches are tending to get older, and young people are drifting from churches after they graduate from high school. Not only that, but churches, they're not just aging, but they're struggling overall, and they're shrinking. No major Christian tradition in the U.S., Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, no major Christian tradition is growing in the U.S. today. Some are holding steady, and some are growing outside of the U.S., but none that I'm aware of is growing in the U.S. And according to research by the Pew Religious Forum, the number of religious nuns, and I always need to spell this out, that's N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. But the number of religious nuns, in other words, those who have no religious affiliation, here in the U.S. has increased from 16 to 23% in the last 7 years. Friends, that is a dramatic increase. So as we look at churches in the country, as we look at churches in your home state, the typical church is aging and shrinking. And we at Fuller Seminary, and specifically we at the team at the Fuller Youth Institute, we started dreaming, what if this isn't the whole story? What if in the midst of so many churches struggling, we could really find those churches that are doing amazing work with the young people and learn from them? And so we followed a methodology very similar to Jim Collins in the book Good to Great, where he looked at amazing companies that were truly great. We did the same thing. We looked at amazing churches. Specifically, we looked at churches that we called growing young churches. And you can see the definition of churches that are growing young in the screen. Churches that aren't shrinking and aging, but are growing and involving and retaining young people, ages 15 to 29, which brings overall vitality to the whole church. We identified 250 of these congregations all over the country, including here in Michigan. We did a vast research process, over 4 years of research, largely funded by the Lilly Endowment as well as other amazing foundations. 1,300 interviews, 10,000 research hours, 10,000 pages of transcripts. And to our delight, half of the churches that we studied that were growing young were not predominantly white. God is working in such amazingly diverse churches these days. All the research, all 4 years of research is summarized in our book, Growing Young. I'm going to spend some time diving into what I think is most relevant. And in particular, I want you to see that in this slide, the word vitality is bolded in green. One of the wonderful twists in our research is that we started the project because we wanted to see how churches were changing young people. But along the way, we found not just how churches are changing young people, but how young people are changing churches. How they bring more life, passion, creativity, energy, and sometimes even money to churches. Now you might say, wait a second, 15 to 29-year-olds bring money to churches? How does that work? Sometimes they have parents. Other times, even if they're new and launching in their career and not able to tithe much, there are those over 30 who want to be part of dynamic churches. And I'll tell you, I'm biased here, but I can't think of any way to have a church become more dynamic than to have it infused with young people who are passionate about their faith, who are passionate about Jesus Christ. So all of a sudden, when young people start joining a church, often those over 30 start being attracted to that same church even more. We saw this with this particular church, St. John's in Indianapolis. This was one of the amazing growing young churches that we got to study, that I got to visit, one of the 250 churches. About 12 years ago, this church in downtown Indianapolis was about to shut its doors. But then the people in this church, they decided, you know what? It is not too late, the road is not too hard, and we are not too old. And they started making the changes that we're going to talk about today. This church that was about to lock its doors, that was down to less than 50 people, when I went and visited it, this church is now 1,500 people, 1,000 of whom are under 30. Now, that was one of the more dramatic turnaround stories. For most churches, it was more incremental steps of growth and change. But you just never know what God's going to do when you put into practice the 6 core commitments that we unearthed through the 4 years of our research. Now, I'm not going to be able to take the time to go into all 6. This is what we call the Growing Young Wheel, and it shows all 6. And again, we do a deep dive in our Growing Young book, co-authored with Jake Mulder and Brad Griffin. We explore these in depth. I'm going to go into 3 today, so let me briefly summarize the 3 that we're not going to dive into today. The 3 that we're not going to dive into today are the way that these churches empathized with young people, really understood young people's quest for identity, belonging, and purpose. Another that we're not going to go into today is the way that the churches embodied and taught Jesus' message. Churches that are growing young, they are ruthless about not teaching the trappings of Christianity or Christian culture, but on staying wholeheartedly focused on the life, death, teachings, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And then the 6th core commitment that we're not going to dive into today is how these churches neighbored well, how they served locally and globally, and how that was magnetic to young people, and how that was transformative to their community and to our world. I'm going to focus today on the 3 that I felt especially burdened to share based on what I knew about you who are going to be part of this January series, either live or we're thrilled with the over 50 sites who are joining us simulcast. One of the things I love about research as a long-time, lifelong researcher is when it unearths myths. When we realize that some of the things that we've thought to be true about life and church and discipleship and young people aren't really true at all. And one of the myths that we saw in our Growing Young research is that you don't have to be a young, hip leader to connect with young people. The older I get, the more of a relief this is. Now, don't get me wrong. We did have some young, hip leaders in our study. At the time of our study, Rich Wilkerson Jr. on the right, he was a leader at a dynamic church in Florida. His wife is on the left. Rich performed the wedding of Kanye and Kim Kardashian. I think it's Kim, right? Yeah, see, you college students, you know. Yeah, it's Kim Kardashian. Rich performed that wedding ceremony. He's very young and hip. Another young and hip leader in our study is Peter Ahn from New Jersey. The next slide that I'm going to show you is the youth leader in our study of all 250 churches, who I think if you were to eavesdrop on our research team, this youth leader that I'm going to show you the picture of is the youth leader we've talked about the most. The leader that our team kept going back to time and time again as we talked about what it takes to be effective with young people. And she would be the first to say, I'm not particularly young. She would be the first to say, I'm not particularly hip. But this is Vonda. Vonda Bjorklund. She's over 60 years old at a small rural church in Volga, South Dakota. Vonda is a volunteer youth pastor. She's a full-time PE teacher at the local public school. This is the youth leader that we talked about more than any other. We studied full-time youth leaders at churches of over 10,000, and let me tell you, we talked about them too, but we actually talked more about Vonda. Another effective leader at a church growing young, who would be the first to say that he's not particularly young or hip, would be Jesse in the middle there. At a Baptist church in Chicago, he became somebody that we came to really respect because he embodied the key of what it means to be an effective leader with young people today. You don't have to be young and hip. Okay, so what is it that you do have to be? What does it mean to be a leader that engages well with teenagers and young adults today? The best way that I can describe it to you is to tell the story of a youth pastor we met during the course of our research named Stretch Dean. With a nickname like Stretch, he's bound to be a youth pastor, right? So this is Stretch Dean, now a senior pastor, but at the time was a youth pastor. And Stretch told our research team about when he was 16 and got his driver's license. His parents handed him the key to the family car and said, Stretch, you can go wherever you want this afternoon. Stretch was a very involved youth group kid, so he drove down to his church. He's just gotten the keys to the car. He drives down to his church. And he gets there after school, and right about the time that the church's after-school daycare that they provide every weekday afternoon was letting out. And the director of the after-school care sees Stretch, and she knows Stretch, and she likes Stretch, and she respects Stretch. And so she goes over to Stretch and says, Stretch, I see you're driving now. That's great. We really need to hire a few more after-school staff. We'd love to have you be part of our team. It comes with a salary and a key to the church. Stretch thinks, awesome. I'm 16 years old and I'm getting a key to the car and now a key to the church. This is fantastic. 3 days later, he's working at the church in the after-school care, and the youth pastor sees Stretch. The youth pastor knows Stretch, likes Stretch, respects Stretch. So the youth pastor goes over to Stretch and says, Stretch, we've got a job that I think you would be perfect for. It needs to be done once a week. We need somebody to reload the soda machine once a week here at church. Now, the youth pastor knew Stretch's love language. The youth pastor says, Stretch, I can't offer you a salary, but I can give you a key to the soda machine and all the Mountain Dew you can drink. Stretch is thinking, this is awesome. He says yes. In just a matter of time, of a week, he gets a key to the car, a key to the church, and a key to the soda machine. Matter of days after that, he's in his church's worship center, on his own, nobody there. It's a weekday, and he's praying, and he senses God calling him into long-term vocational ministry. Not an audible voice, but the Holy Spirit speaking clearly into Stretch's spirit. And the Holy Spirit says something like, Stretch, you like being at church, right? We'll get used to it, because I'm calling you to ministry. And now Stretch, a few decades later, is meeting with our research team, and he says, it was because my church handed me the keys of leadership. That's a big part of what opened me up to hearing God's call. As a research team, we heard that story, and we thought about the threads of narratives that had woven their way through the other 250 churches, and we thought about what we had heard from the 1,300 interviews, and what we came up with is the first core commitment. The first core commitment on that wheel that I showed you is this. It's key chain leadership. You want to be an effective leader with young people? You want your church to grow young? Then we need to be leaders who hand keys to young people. Now, in the case of Stretch, it was literal keys. I'm not necessarily talking about literal keys. What are we talking about then? We're not just talking about a student leadership team or a young adult leadership team. That might be part of it. But instead, what we're saying is keys refer to the capabilities, power, and access of leaders who carry the potential to empower young people. If you're here in this room, if you're watching on simulcast, I'm pretty sure that you have capabilities, power, and access. You have metaphorical keys that you can hand over to young people. You have some way that you can help them be a little bit more involved, sense their gifts a little bit more, feel a little bit more at home, feel a little bit more a part of your church, a little bit more a part of your small group, a little bit more a part of that ministry to people who are homeless that you lead every Saturday morning. I love that our research demolishes the myth that we have to be young and hip to be effective with young people. We don't have to be that. We just have to have the courage and be willing to hand over the keys. Now, sometimes we're afraid to hand over the keys because we think young people might fail. And they might. But if I could be honest with you for a moment, I think a bigger obstacle for me isn't so much I'm afraid young people are going to fail, but sometimes I'm afraid to hand over the keys because I think they might succeed more than me. And then how will that work? How will that look? If I'm supposed to be the one in charge, if I've got a certain title and all of a sudden this young person I hand the keys over to surpasses my gifts, I have to work through those issues of control and be willing to let young people flourish and exceed even what I have been able to do. Part of what we're committed to at the Full Youth Institute is not only to do research, but to turn research into resources with practical ideas. And so with each of our core commitments, the three I hit really quickly at the start of this talk, as well as the three that we're going into more in depth, I'm going to give you at least one idea so you can make progress on this in your church. And when it comes to keychain leadership, I'm actually going to give you two ideas that build on each other. First, identify who's ready for keys. Identify who's ready for keys. I've been praying for you all today that you would be thinking about young people that you can hand the keys over to. You would be thinking about a young person that you could mentor a little bit. You'd be thinking about a young person who's ready for a new opportunity, who's ready to lead on the tech team with you, who's ready to facilitate a small group with you, who's ready to teach the third grade Sunday school class with you. But it's not just handing over the keys, and this is the mistake we make in churches. We need to actually train young people how to use the keys. A lot of times we just kind of toss the keys in young people's direction, and then we're wondering why they don't succeed. And then when they don't succeed, we take the keys back. We need to think not just about who are we going to hand the keys over to, but how do we train them to really use their gifts well. So that's the first core commitment. And by the way, it's the first core commitment because as we looked at how the 6 core commitments occur most commonly chronologically in a church, this is the one that usually happen first. They can happen in all different orders, but we put them in the order in our book that matches how they most commonly occurred. And it usually started with the ways that we handed keys over to young people. Now let's move to the next core commitment. It's not just about how we lead. There's another factor involved. It's about how we build relationships. See, because you can download good preaching, but you can't download thoughtful mentoring. We can download good preaching, but young people can't download thoughtful mentoring. That's something that we can offer them in a unique and powerful way that they often can't get anywhere else and certainly can't get online. Fascinatingly, when we spent time at churches that are growing young and spent time interviewing the young people at these churches, and we asked them, what do you love the most about your church? See, a lot of times we assume that young people are going to say, oh, I love my friends. Or I love how fun it is. Or we get people say, oh, young people love it when churches have free food. All of that is true. But you want to know actually the leading answer for young people at churches that are growing young, what they love about their church? They say that it's like family. What do they love about their church? As we're transitioning to the next core commitment, it's like family. It's like family. Here's what one young person told us during the course of the interview. This is life. It's not just church life. It's life. It's hard. It's busy, but we're in it together. We're like a family. So out of our research, not only did we say we need to hand over keys in our churches, but we also said we need to fuel a warm community. We need to fuel a warm community. This is so important as a core commitment. We can't lay off the gas pedal here. We need to go all in on warm community. And in fact, as we studied the words that young people use to describe their churches, we came up with what we call the warmth cluster. These are the actual adjectives, the actual attributes that young people use to describe their churches that were warm. These churches that are growing young, that aren't aging or shrinking, but are thriving with teenagers and young adults. This church was welcoming. This church was accepting, belonging, authentic, hospitable, caring. Hear these words from young people themselves. One of the churches growing young that we studied was in Pennsylvania. And we were going to go visit the church, and so before we visited the church, we did interviews with teenagers and young adults at the church. And we asked them, what do you love the most about your church? What draws you to your church? And teenagers and young adults kept talking about Bill, how much they loved Bill. Teenagers would talk about how Bill would show up at basketball games and be sitting in the stands and cheering them on, or showing up at the high school play, sitting in the pews and cheering them on. Young adults would talk about how Bill would come to where they worked and take them out to coffee. We kept hearing about Bill. So as a research team, we thought, boy, we can't wait to meet Bill. We get to this church in Pennsylvania. We meet Bill. It turns out Bill, at the time, was 72 years old. And as Bill told us, he remembers an adolescence where nobody was showing up in the stands for him. Adults weren't coming to cheer him on when he was in sports, when he was in the play. Nobody was taking him out as a 20-something for coffee. And so Bill has resolved that that is not going to be true for the young people at his church. And so he has made it his mission, his quest, to make sure that young people are surrounded by this warm community. And not just Bill, but he's recruiting other adults, especially senior adults, to be part of this team that's loving young people, that's finding out what's going on in the lives of the young people of their church and is showing up and is cheering them on. And as we spent time with Bill, Bill said, yeah, in fact, I've even written up a one-page summary of what I want adults to do. Show up in the lives of young people. And we said, oh, Bill, that's wonderful. Will you send that to us? And he said, yeah, I'd be happy to. So he sent it to us. This is the sheet of paper from Bill in Pennsylvania. And he faxed it to us from the local library. This is how Bill got this sheet of paper to us. You see, a lot of time we believe these myths, that in order to connect with young people, we have to have contemporary worship. I've already been asked that here today at Calvin. We spent a lot of time in our book trying to describe this. Most churches had many of their worship elements that were contemporary or were modern, but by no means all, and by no means all of the worship elements were like that. Please don't think that if we just substitute out the organ and bring in the keyboard, that's going to connect with young people. Please don't think that you need an off-the-charts cool quotient. Instead, here's what one senior pastor told us during the course of our research, and it's one of my favorite phrases from all of our research. When it comes to young people, warm is the new cool. Warm is the new cool with young people. We saw this time and time again in our data. Let me just share a little bit. Interestingly, pastors were twice as likely to mention the music that their church offered as being key to their effectiveness with young people as young people themselves. Young people were pointing to the relationships. Pastors pointed to relationships, but they were also much more likely to point to the music than young people themselves. So again, let's translate this idea of warm is the new cool, this warmth core commitment into some ideas. How do we have our worship gatherings feel less like theater and more like family room? Less like theater and more like family room. Erwin McManus, who was one of our advisors in the project, he said this: too many times we have kept our pews, but we have lost our children. Another worship pastor that we interviewed during the course of our research said this: excellence can be the death grip of warmth. Always striving for excellence can sometimes cool a worship climate. Now, I've seen churches, and I've been part of churches that go to the other extreme and end up downright sloppy. We're not saying that. But how do we create an environment that's intergenerational, that's warm, where all are welcome, and it's going to be a little bit more messy? When kids are in the mix, when young people are in the mix, things get a little bit more chaotic. I'm going to play you about a 60-second video clip from a BBC interview where it was supposed to be just an adult-to-adult scenario, and all of a sudden, the adult being interviewed, his kids kind of ended up in the mix, and it got a little bit messy. And his wife tries to get the kids removed. You'll see what I'm talking about. I mean, this is what happens when young people get involved. Let's watch it together.
Scandals happen all the time. The question is, how do democracies respond to those scandals?
And what will it mean for the wider region? I think one of your children has just walked in. I mean, shifting sands in the region. Do you think relations with the North may change?
I would be surprised if they do. Pardon me. My apologies.
What's this going to mean for the region?
My apologies. Sorry. South Korea's policy choices on North Korea have been severely limited in the last 6 months to a year.
Yeah, I love that moment the most also when the wife comes in and tries to shut the door. So, like, some of us have been in worship experiences that are somewhat like that. Out of our research, here's what we're saying. A little bit of chaos, it's worth it if it's warm and authentic and if it's real. Here's what else we found when it comes to developing warm relationships. Here's another idea I want to leave you with. When it comes to community with young people, create both on-ramps and road trips. Churches that are growing young do this well. An on-ramp is a shorter invitation for community, especially for 20-somethings, especially for young adults. There's a transience about the young adult stage these days. And, we invite them to be part of a 6-month or a year-long small group. That feels like an eternity to them. So creative churches are offering on-ramps. They're offering 2 or 3 week mentoring invitations that then can transition into longer relationships, but they're offering an easier way for people to get their foot in the door of relational community and then get a taste and want the long-term feast. Out of our research with Warm Community, we're also recommending this. We develop a new 5-to-1 ratio. We touched on this in our previous Sticky Faith research also, and it comes out of the brilliant thinking of my friend Chap Clark. If I was to come to your church this next weekend and talk to your children's ministry team or student ministry team, odds are good you'd be talking about some kind of ratio. Your team would be talking about, we want 1 adult for every 5 kids. What we say out of our research is, instead of 1 adult for every 5 young people, what if we reverse that and we have 5 adults for every young person? 5 adults who are on that kids' team. Now, I'm not talking about 5 small group leaders. I'm not talking about 5 Bible study leaders. I'm not talking about 5 Sunday school teachers. I'm talking about 5 adults who are like Bill, who are showing up for the robotics competition, who are going to the graduation, who are sending a note every once in a while saying, hey, I'm praying for you. And as I mentioned, our oldest is in 12th grade, and the importance of that 5-to-1 team, I'll tell you, it is in bold capital letters for our family and for Dave and me with our son Nathan. To crystallize Nathan's team, we did something for his 18th birthday a few months ago. He turned 18 in September, and he plays volleyball. All 3 of our kids play volleyball. Our kids tend to be tall and athletic, and they don't like touching the other team. So volleyball is perfect for the PAL kids. And so Dave and I got a white volleyball, and we drove it all around Southern California and had all the adults who are significant in Nathan's life sign it. Also, his 2 sisters signed it. You can see on the right. Krista wrote the better sibling. She's 16, and then our 12-year-old Jessica wrote the real better sibling. So, not everything is all sweetness and light in the Powell family all the time. So, we gave this volleyball to Nathan, and it now sits on his shelf in his room. But even more importantly, he's planning on taking it to college with him, wherever he goes. He might be staying at home, but he's going to have that volleyball with him. He's written an essay in his college application about that volleyball. Parents, grandparents, church members, how do we create this 5-person team for the young people we care about? That is part of what it means to be warm community. And then the last of 3 core commitments that I want to focus on with you today is the way that we prioritize young people and their families everywhere. The way that we inordinately prioritize young people. Now, if you were paying really close attention to the growing young wheel that I showed, there's something a little unusual right around 9 o'clock. If we were thinking of that wheel like a church, right around 9 o'clock, there's an arrow that juts out to the left. Right about the transition as we're entering this core commitment of prioritization. That's because what we found is churches could do the other core commitments, including what I've talked about, handing keys over to young people and being warm. Churches could do those core commitments and be good churches. What separates a church from being a good church to being a church that's truly growing young and not growing old is the way that they prioritize young people. It's the way that they say, you know what, young people, it's not just one of our top 10, it's one of our top 3 or our top 5 that we care about, that we're thinking about. And it's not just rhetoric, but it's our reality. One of the churches growing young that I got to visit was about a 200-person Latino church. It was technically Baptist, but I'll tell you, it was the most charismatic Pentecostal Baptist church that I have ever been to. It was fantastic. And this church, Latino, most of the adults speak Spanish. Some of them speak only Spanish. Limited English. English is a second language. And what this church was realizing, though, is that for the young people, many of them were speaking primarily English. And so the adults in this church had a discussion and ended up eventually taking a vote over this question: should we offer part of our worship experience and part of our church's programs in English so that it's showing that we're prioritizing young people? Adults in the church, some of whom don't speak English, some of whom don't understand English, voted yes. We should offer parts of our worship experience and part of our church's ministry in English to show that we're prioritizing young people, even if it means I, who don't speak English, won't fully understand it. I think about all the controversy some churches have over particular songs, over particular drum beats. And then I think about this church, where adults in the church were willing to not understand part of the worship experience because they were prioritizing young people. And I am humbled and I am convicted. So let's think together about what it means to prioritize young people in all sorts of ways. It doesn't necessarily mean a big modern building. If you have a big and/or modern building, awesome, that's a great tool. But if you don't feel like that means you can't prioritize young people. And it doesn't mean you have to have a big budget. There is something about your budget that is related to prioritization that we'll get to in a minute. What does it mean? It means intentionally paying attention to young people. Prioritizing young people means we're paying attention to young people and their families. We're thinking about young people and their families. Here's where budget comes into play. Many of you who are with us today or watching us on simulcast or watching later, I know that you have a role in your church where you're pretty familiar with your budget. I believe a church's budget is a reflection or a manifesto of that church's priorities. And so I would just ask you, where are young people in your church's budget? What priorities would I be able to observe about your church if I looked at your church's budget? It's not about the size of your church's budget, it's about the way that that budget is allocated according to our research. It's not just your budget, though. Giving young people priority means that we prioritize families. We think not just about the young person, but about their overall family too. Now, far too many parents view the church as what my friend and colleague Pam King calls a dry cleaner. They think they can bring their kids, parents think they can bring their kids on Sunday morning to the church all spiritually dirty, check them into church, and then 60, 90 minutes later, check them out and they've been spiritually cleaned. Because that pastor, that small group leader, that Sunday school teacher has done the cleaning. And what we say out of our research is the ideal, the way that God's designed it, is that church and family are partnering together for the spiritual formation of young people. Now, as a parent myself, I gotta say, being a parent is no easy gig. Somebody just said amen. My job at Fuller Seminary is pretty tough, but it's a piece of chocolate cake compared to being a parent. And I love my kids, don't get me wrong. In fact, here's a picture of me in the middle, my husband Dave, Nathan, our 12th grader, Jessica, our 7th grader, Krista, our 10th grader. Now, when our friend Adria came over to take this picture for a Christmas card. Unbeknownst to us, she kept taking pictures even when we weren't posing for it. So the next picture I'm going to show you is our family more in our natural habitat. So this is the picture that went on the Christmas card, but this is the one that Adria captured of our family more naturally. I actually wish the Christmas card had both pictures because I think that's more accurate. I do want to call your attention to my husband in the upper right-hand corner in this picture and in this picture also. So he's an engineer while the rest of us are more like this. And I'll tell you, I think parents today face new challenges. I graduated from high school in 1987, and when I graduated from high school, the line that we kind of walked, as many of us went from high school to college, to job, to marriage, to kids. For young people today, it's not nearly that linear. It's far more circuitous. Paths are all over the place. There's gap year, living together, internships, travel abroad, living at home, roommates, sometimes even leaving the map altogether. I think parenting, not just teenagers, but college age and young adults up into the 20-somethings, it's a whole new frontier. And that's why I'm so glad that along with my colleague and friend Steve Argue, we've co-authored a new book, Building on Growing Young. This comes out in 2 months, in March, called Growing With. See, a lot of times we as parents of teenagers and young adults, we're afraid that as our kid grows up, we're going to grow apart. We don't have to believe that lie. According to our research, we don't have to grow apart. We can grow with our kid. And churches that are growing young are prioritizing their young people and prioritizing families. They understand that, and they're creating communication and training rhythms for parents. They're giving parents the support that they need to win, not just in faith, but in all domains of a young person's formation. And then wrapping up, prioritizing young people means young people play a load-bearing role in a church. The churches that are growing young, they gave young people significant tasks, significant responsibilities, significant roles in their churches, developmentally appropriate, well-mentored, well-supported, all that. But here's what one woman said during the course of our research at her church. She said, part of belonging is serving. Instead of saying, no, you're too young, we say, do you want to be involved? We give lots of on-the-job training, then they do ministry and see change happen, which raises their excitement. They participate and see the fruit. They know they're part of the church. They know they play an integral role because the church has so prioritized them. As one pastor told us, he said, if it wasn't for our young people, this church would shut down. And the young people knew that young people were that important. Before we go to Q&A, I want to leave you with one last story that inspires me. I mentioned my husband's an engineer. He never met a spreadsheet he doesn't like. As we were doing our Growing Young research and as we were realizing that churches that grow young, they're prioritizing young people. Even when it comes to budget, they're prioritizing young people and families. The math side of me, the math side of my husband, our research team, we thought, well, if young people are getting a little bit more, then surely somebody's going to be getting a little bit less. I mean, that makes sense, right? Mathematically. It's going to be women's ministry or senior adult ministry or somebody's going to feel like they're getting the short end of the stick. So this became one of our research questions. With lead pastor after lead pastor and senior pastor after senior pastor, I mean, I personally was dogged about this question. I asked this: when you give young people more energy, more attention, more priority, who gets the short end of the stick? And church after church said, nobody does. Because when we start with this question, how will young people be involved? When we're constantly thinking, hey, Easter's coming up. Let's not make young people the 10th question we ask, but let's make their involvement in Easter service, in our Lent experience, one of the top 5 questions that we ask. When we prioritize young people, here's what one senior pastor said. If you think of our resources in our church like a pie, and if we give young people a bigger slice of the pie, it's not that somebody else gets a smaller piece of the pie. It's not like women's ministry gets a smaller piece or senior adult gets a smaller piece. What this senior pastor said is when we give younger people a bigger piece of the pie, it's like the entire pie grows. Again, the heart of this research was to study how are churches changing young people. And maybe if you hear anything, I think what I want you to hear is we certainly found how churches are changing young people, but we definitively also found how young people are changing churches. To help you stay in touch with all of our research, Growing Young, Growing With, our previous Sticky Faith research, we want to give you free resources. And so whether you're watching live, whether you're watching simulcast, whether you're watching in some months, if you get out your phone and text the word free to 66866, so the phone number is 66866, and then text the word free, you're going to get a link to all sorts of resources to help you as a parent, a grandparent, a congregation member, a pastor leader, doesn't matter your role. We have resources for you. Now, I know some of you are worried because that's a lot of 6s up there in a row, okay? But don't worry. We put an 8 right in the middle, okay? So it's 66866. So thank you, and Karen's going to come and we're going to ask some questions together.